They were young, in love, and ready to begin their new life together. A dream honeymoon on a secluded private island in 1997 was supposed to mark the start of forever. Instead, it became the last place they were ever seen alive. The ocean sparkled, the palms swayed, and the luxury of paradise promised everything they could want. But just days into their stay, they vanished without a trace. No distress call, no signs of struggle, just a perfectly made bed, 2 untouched cocktails by the shore, and silence. For nearly a decade, their families searched for answers, clinging to hope while whispers of foul play and dark secrets spread. And then, 9 years later, tourists stumbled across something so chilling it would change the way the world viewed the island forever. This is not just a story about a disappearance. It's a warning about how even the most beautiful places can hide the darkest truths. Let me take you back to June 14, 1997. 26-year-old Daniel Foster and his 24-year-old bride, Melissa Clark, had just exchanged vows in a small ceremony in Florida. They were radiant. Daniel, a young financial analyst who had recently earned his promotion, and Melissa, an aspiring photographer known among her friends for capturing light in the most unexpected places. For their honeymoon, they wanted more than sandy beaches crowded with tourists. They booked a trip to a private island resort off the coast of the Bahamas, an exclusive retreat advertised as a paradise untouched by time. The brochures promised peace, seclusion, and romance. But what they didn't know was that behind the marketing, the island held a history locals whispered about but never shared with outsiders. A history of people who had gone there and never returned. Daniel and Melissa arrived at the island on a bright Saturday afternoon, their laughter carrying across the dock as they stepped off the resort's private boat. Witnesses remembered them holding hands, Daniel joking that he'd never seen water so clear. They checked into a beachfront bungalow, tucked away from the main lodge. Staff recalled how happy they seemed, how Melissa couldn't stop taking photos of the shoreline, how Daniel teased her about filling up all her film rolls in the first 2 days. They dined that evening by candlelight, the ocean breeze brushing against them, and returned to their room before 10 p.m. The next morning, they ate breakfast together. And then, they vanished. When housekeepers entered their bungalow the following day, they found the bed neatly made, Daniel's wallet and Melissa's purse sitting untouched on the dresser. Their luggage was still there. 2 half-empty glasses of champagne rested on the porch rail, condensation dripping down their sides. But Daniel and Melissa were gone. No one had seen them leave. No one heard a struggle. The resort staff searched the island for hours, combing the beaches, checking the trails, calling out their names. Nothing. The local authorities were called, but without evidence of a crime, the case quickly grew cold. To outsiders, it seemed as though the Newlyweds had simply walked into the ocean and disappeared. But those who knew them rejected that explanation. They weren't reckless. They weren't the type to vanish willingly. Something had happened. Something the island itself seemed determined to keep hidden. At first, the theory was that they had drowned while swimming. The resort quietly circulated this explanation to reassure future guests. But there were problems. No clothing, no personal belongings, no bodies washed ashore. The ocean currents in the area typically returned debris within days. Yet weeks passed with nothing. And why were their shoes neatly lined up by the bungalow door, as if they had only stepped out for a walk? Melissa's camera was later found inside the bungalow, its last photograph showing her smiling on the beach with Daniel's arm around her. The picture was time-stamped just hours before their disappearance. The families were frantic. Daniel's parents flew down from Miami within days, demanding answers. Melissa's sister, Claire, begged authorities to widen the search, but the island's small police force had limited resources. The case soon became entangled in jurisdictional disputes between local law enforcement, the resort's management, and international authorities. By July, the search had slowed to almost nothing. The resort quietly moved new guests into the bungalow where the couple had stayed, as though nothing had happened. And here's where I want to pause for a moment. Not in the story, but with you. If you're watching this right now, you need to ask yourself, How many stories like this have you never heard about because they simply faded from the headlines? How many families never got closure because no one kept the pressure on? Don't just scroll past. Subscribe right now, because the truth is, if you stop listening, these stories die in silence, and the next time, it could be someone you know. As weeks turned to months, speculation grew. Locals whispered about the island being cursed. Some suggested the couple had been victims of foul play, perhaps stumbling across something they weren't meant to see. There were rumors of drug smuggling routes hidden within the region, and of shadowy figures who used the remoteness of the island as cover. Others believed the resort itself knew more than it was admitting. After all, how could two people vanish from a small private island without someone noticing? But without bodies, without evidence, the whispers remained whispers. By late 1997, Daniel and Melissa's disappearance had faded from international news. Their families continued to push for answers, but each year the silence grew heavier. Birthdays and anniversaries passed in grief. Melissa's sister Claire later recalled, "It was like waiting for a phone call that never came. You don't sleep. You don't live. You just wait." Yet in the quiet, the island kept its secret. Until 9 years later, when two tourists on a hiking trail would stumble across something that would finally reveal the unthinkable. In the summer of 2006, almost 9 years after Daniel and Melissa vanished, a married couple from Canada named Robert and Elaine Peterson decided to spend their anniversary on the same island. Unlike the honeymooners in 1997, they weren't after seclusion as much as they were after adventure. The resort had recently added new hiking excursions along overgrown inland trails that promised a wilderness experience. On a sweltering July afternoon, the Petersons set out with water bottles, cameras, and a guidebook that was already fraying at the edges. They wandered farther than most guests dared, away from the sound of the waves and deeper into the dense vegetation that swallowed the interior of the island. That's when Elaine spotted something half buried in the dirt, a fragment of faded fabric. At first, she thought it was just trash, but as Robert tugged it free, the shape of a torn backpack emerged, its zippers rusted and its straps brittle with age. Inside, they found a crumbling wallet, sun-bleached and almost destroyed by time. Within it was a driver's license, the name still legible, Daniel Foster. The Petersons froze. Their island getaway had suddenly become a nightmare. Nearby, they found more. The shattered remains of what looked like a shoe, a tangle of cloth, and not far away, what they first thought were rocks bleached white by the sun. But these weren't rocks. They were bones, human bones. They rushed back to the resort in shock, clutching the wallet and fragments of fabric, demanding authorities be called immediately. At first, staff seemed reluctant, even nervous. It took hours before local law enforcement was finally summoned, and when investigators arrived, their initial response was strangely muted, as though they already knew more than they were willing to admit. The Petersons were asked to give statements but then discreetly encouraged to continue enjoying their vacation. Elaine later said, "It was like they wanted us to forget what we saw." But the discovery couldn't be buried this time. News spread quickly, and within days, international media once again descended on the island. The families of Daniel and Melissa flew in, desperate for confirmation. Forensic teams combed the site where the Petersons had made their grim find. The remains were scattered across a small clearing, suggesting exposure to the elements for many years. Alongside them, fragments of clothing matched what Melissa had been wearing on her last known day. A rusted wedding band engraved with Daniel's initials was found in the soil just a few feet away. The evidence was undeniable. The honeymooners had not left the island alive. But the question remained, what happened to them? Authorities initially floated the theory that Daniel and Melissa had wandered inland on a hike, gotten lost, and succumbed to the elements. It was an explanation that seemed convenient, neat, and easy to close a file with. But the families weren't convinced. Daniel's father argued that his son was meticulous about planning, never impulsive. Melissa's sister pointed out that her sibling had been terrified of deep forest hikes, preferring the safety of the beaches. And perhaps the most disturbing detail, there was no sign of camera equipment. Melissa never went anywhere without her camera, yet not a trace of it was recovered at the site. As speculation grew, journalists began to dig into the resort's history. That's when unsettling details surfaced. Over the decades, there had been other quiet disappearances, names that never made headlines beyond local papers. A fisherman in the 1970s who supposedly never returned from a solo trip. A tourist couple in the early 1980s who were reported missing, only for the resort to claim they had checked out early. Each case was dismissed at the time, but when viewed together, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. And here's the part that should make every viewer stop and think. How many stories like Daniel and Melissa's never get told because resorts, companies, or even authorities fear bad publicity? How many families live the rest of their lives in torment because the truth was quietly swept under the rug? If you're listening to this, don't just sit back. Subscribe right now. Because by staying silent, you help powerful people bury stories just like this. And the next time you take a vacation, the truth they've hidden could be the difference between life and death. Back on the island, investigators released their preliminary findings. Partial skeletal remains consistent with 2 adults, Daniel's identification, and personal effects linking the site to the couple. But what chilled observers most was the location. The clearing where they were found was less than a mile from the resort staff service trail, close enough that anyone who wanted to could have reached it quickly. Why hadn't it been found earlier? Why hadn't the original searches scoured this area thoroughly in 1997? Some speculated that the area had been deliberately overlooked. Witnesses from the resort in 1997 began to come forward years later, recalling strange details they hadn't dared mention at the time. A staff member remembered seeing Daniel arguing with a man near the docks on the couple's second day, someone who wasn't part of the resort staff. Another recalled hearing shouting near the service trail that same night, though management dismissed it as island sounds. Theories swirled. Had Daniel and Melissa stumbled across smuggling operations? Had they witnessed something they weren't supposed to? Or had the island itself become the perfect cover for someone to commit a crime, knowing that the ocean and jungle would erase the evidence? Forensic experts tried to answer questions, but the remains were too incomplete to establish a definitive cause of death. No obvious trauma, no clear signs of violence, but also no evidence of natural causes. It was as if the island had swallowed their story whole and returned only fragments. But one thing was certain. Daniel and Melissa hadn't simply wandered off for a hike and failed to return. Something had drawn them to that remote clearing, and something had kept them from ever leaving it alive. The discovery reignited international fascination, but it also sparked anger. Melissa's sister Claire gave a tearful statement. For 9 years we begged them to keep looking. For 9 years we were told there was nothing to find, and all along they were right there. The question was no longer just about what happened to the couple. It was about why no one had found them sooner, and whether someone had wanted it that way. The discovery of Daniel and Melissa's remains sent shockwaves through both the media and the travel industry, but it also opened a door that many wished had stayed shut. Suddenly, questions poured in from journalists, independent investigators, and even former resort employees. Why had the search in 1997 been so limited? Who had been responsible for deciding which areas to check? And perhaps most chilling of all, what exactly had the Newlyweds seen in their final hours that led them to that clearing in the jungle? The island's management scrambled to protect its reputation. Press releases insisted that the tragedy was an unfortunate accident, the result of the couple wandering too far inland without proper preparation. But behind closed doors, staff whispered a different story. Some remembered unusual activity on the island in the weeks before the disappearance. Unmarked boats docking late at night, equipment carried through the service trails under tarps, and the quiet presence of men who didn't seem connected to the resort but were given free access. It was as though the island had a second life, one hidden from the smiling guests sipping cocktails by the shore. Independent journalist Michael Graves, drawn by the mystery, flew to the island in late 2006. He interviewed locals, former staff, and law enforcement officers who had long since retired. Piece by piece, he assembled a chilling picture. The island wasn't just a private resort, it was also a hub for covert activity. Smugglers had allegedly used the isolated coves for decades, and some even suggested there were underground storage facilities built during the Cold War, abandoned, but occasionally repurposed. Graves wrote in his article, "The island's beauty masks its shadows. To visit as a guest is to see only what you are allowed to see." What troubled investigators most was the condition of the remains. Forensic analysis showed that the bones had been moved at some point, perhaps scattered deliberately to avoid detection. The belongings found with them, Daniel's wallet, the fragments of Melissa's clothing, were all damaged, but their placement suggested they had not simply fallen where the couple died. It raised an unsettling possibility. Had the Newlyweds been killed elsewhere on the island and then left in the clearing years later, when the search had long since ended? Theories multiplied. Some said Daniel had confronted smugglers moving contraband, perhaps thinking he could reason with them. Others believed Melissa's passion for photography might have captured something she wasn't supposed to. One of her undeveloped rolls of film, if ever found, could have explained everything, but her camera was still missing. The absence of that camera became one of the darkest symbols of the case. Melissa's sister Claire pushed for a renewed investigation. She stood outside the resort during a vigil, holding a photograph of her sibling in her wedding dress, saying through tears, "They thought we'd stop asking. They thought we'd forget. But I will never stop until the truth is known." Her words struck a nerve with viewers around the world. And I need to say this directly to you. It's easy to watch stories like this and move on, but imagine if it were your sister, your daughter, or your best friend who vanished. Would you want people to shrug and scroll away? Or would you want as many voices as possible demanding answers? Don't be passive. Subscribe right now so these stories aren't buried, so families like Claire's aren't left screaming into the void with no one listening. Your click may be the difference between silence and justice. By early 2007, the official investigation had stalled again. Authorities admitted they could not conclusively determine the cause of death. The resort remained open, quietly rebranding to distance itself from the tragedy. But behind the scenes, independent search teams began visiting the island, determined to find more evidence. Among them was Graves, who teamed up with two experienced trackers. They combed the island's less-traveled paths, documenting everything they found. One afternoon in March 2007, about half a mile from the original discovery site, they uncovered something extraordinary. A buried metal box, rusted but intact. Inside were waterlogged papers, some unreadable, but one stood out. It was a page from Melissa's journal, the ink smeared, but her handwriting still visible. The date was June 16, 1997, 2 days after their arrival. The entry was short, but haunting. "Danny says we shouldn't go back to the lodge tonight. He thinks we saw something we weren't meant to. I'm scared, but he says it'll be okay. I hope he's right." The journal fragment changed everything. It confirmed that the couple had been aware of danger, that they had deliberately stayed away from the resort, and that fear had already taken hold in their final hours. But what had they seen? Theories spread like wildfire. Some claimed they had witnessed an illegal arms drop. Others insisted it was drug-related. A few even whispered that the island had ties to secret government programs long buried in classified files. Graves's article, published worldwide, carried the chilling headline, "The Honeymooners Who Knew Too Much." It reignited pressure on authorities, who reluctantly reopened parts of the investigation. Yet the more questions were asked, the more resistance grew. Requests for old resort records were denied, key witnesses suddenly stopped speaking, and some locals claimed they had been warned to let it go. Meanwhile, Daniel's father began his own campaign, writing letters to international embassies and human rights groups. He said bluntly, "I don't believe my son died by accident. Someone knows the truth, and they are keeping it from us." His persistence gained traction, and soon other families of missing tourists across the Caribbean began sharing their own stories, uncanny echoes of disappearances that had never been solved. By the end of 2007, the island was no longer seen as a paradise. It was a place of whispers, of questions no one wanted answered. And still, Melissa's camera remained missing, its absence like a locked door holding the key to the entire mystery. By 2008, the case of Daniel and Melissa Foster had become more than a mystery. It was a battleground between truth and silence. On one side stood grieving families, relentless journalists, and independent investigators who refused to give up. On the other stood powerful interests desperate to protect the island's image and perhaps something far more sinister. The journal fragment Melissa had left behind haunted everyone who read it. "We saw something we weren't meant to." What could that mean? Some investigators speculated that the couple had stumbled upon an illicit transfer of goods or even people hidden behind the facade of paradise. Others believed Melissa had photographed the event, unknowingly sealing their fate. But without the missing camera, it was impossible to know. The resort's management went to extraordinary lengths to distance itself from the growing scandal. Travel brochures scrubbed any mention of the private trails where the remains were found. Former staff who spoke to journalists described being pressured to stay silent. One maid recalled being told never to discuss the honeymoon couple again, or risk losing her livelihood. The pressure wasn't limited to employees. Locals who had first whispered rumors now clammed up completely. Some hinted at shadowy visitors arriving on the island under cover of night, men who were not tourists and who vanished before dawn. It was a pattern, they said, that had existed for decades. But now, with Daniel and Melissa, it had left evidence behind. In early 2009, the investigation took another dramatic turn. Independent tracker Samuel Ortiz, a veteran of desert and jungle searches, returned to the island with permission from Melissa's sister Claire. On a humid afternoon deep in the interior, Ortiz discovered something that sent chills down his spine. A rusted metal tripod, half collapsed, with fragments of photographic film clinging to the soil beneath it. The film was destroyed beyond recognition, but its presence suggested Melissa had indeed been taking pictures in the days before her disappearance. The discovery fueled the theory that her camera had captured something that made the couple targets. Meanwhile, Graves published a follow-up article, this one more damning than the last. He openly accused the resort and local authorities of negligence, if not outright cover-up. "This island is not just a vacation paradise," he wrote. "It is a place where secrets go to die, and where the innocent pay the price." The article went viral, drawing new attention and outrage. Claire seized the moment, holding a press conference where she displayed the recovered journal fragment. She looked directly into the cameras and said, "If you had been in my sister's shoes, if you had seen something dangerous and cried for help, wouldn't you want the world to keep fighting for you? Don't let their story fade again." And I'll tell you right now, if you're still watching, ask yourself this. What would you do if it were your family's story being buried? If you knew the truth was out there but being smothered by silence, you wouldn't just walk away. So don't walk away from this. Subscribe. Because the second we stop paying attention, stories like Daniel and Melissa's vanish into darkness forever. That same year, forensic specialists re-examined the bones using advanced technology that hadn't existed in the late 90s. The results were unsettling. Both skeletons showed faint but distinct marks on the ribs and arms, patterns consistent with restraint. Not enough to declare homicide officially, but enough to suggest they hadn't simply lain down in the jungle to die. Experts also concluded that the remains had been exposed to the elements for far less than 9 years, perhaps only 6 or 7. That meant one terrifying thing. The bodies may have been moved years after their disappearance, hidden elsewhere until it was safe to place them in the clearing where they were finally found. The implication was staggering. Someone had deliberately tampered with the remains, ensuring the case stayed cold until the world had largely forgotten. Someone had counted on the silence, but silence was no longer possible. Independent searchers continued combing the island, uncovering scraps of fabric, broken glass, and even a child's toy car buried near one of the staff-only service paths. None of these items belonged to Daniel or Melissa, raising the horrifying possibility that they were not the island's only victims. As pressure mounted, The resort announced it would close temporarily for renovations. Many believed this was a thinly veiled attempt to escape scrutiny. Journalists reported that entire sections of the island were being bulldozed, trails blocked off, and certain structures demolished. Graves warned that vital evidence was being erased. But with limited authority, there was little anyone could do to stop it. Melissa's family, however, refused to give in. Claire spearheaded a campaign to force an international inquiry. She carried with her the journal page and Daniel's recovered wallet as proof of the couple's suffering. In an emotional statement, she said, "For 9 years they told us there was nothing. Then they told us it was an accident. Now we know they were moved like objects. My sister was not nothing. Daniel was not nothing. They deserve the truth." The campaign gained support from human rights organizations, and slowly the tide began to turn. Pressure from outside governments forced local authorities to reopen the case in late 2009. For the first time, investigators openly acknowledged the likelihood of foul play. But the island's silence still hung heavy. Key witnesses had vanished. Records from 1997 were mysteriously missing. And Melissa's camera, the one object that could have revealed everything, remained lost. Then, in 2010, a new clue surfaced that reignited hope. A diver exploring a submerged cave just off the island's northern cove discovered fragments of plastic and metal that appeared to be from a camera body. Though corroded, experts confirmed it was a late 1990s model consistent with the one Melissa had been carrying. The memory card was destroyed by years of salt water, but the discovery proved one thing beyond doubt. Melissa's camera had not simply been misplaced. It had been deliberately discarded into the ocean. The question was no longer whether Daniel and Melissa had died accidentally. The question was who had silenced them and why. By 2011, more than a decade after Daniel and Melissa Foster vanished, the mystery that had begun as a quiet tragedy on a secluded island had become a symbol of unanswered questions that haunt families for life. The discovery of Melissa's camera fragments beneath the ocean was the final proof many needed. Someone had wanted the truth erased. But who? And what had been on those photographs? Michael Graves, who had spent years risking his safety to expose the story, released one last report. He suggested that the island's remoteness had made it a perfect hub for covert operations. Smuggling was the most common theory, but whispers of something deeper remained. Operations involving people, rather than goods, hidden under the cover of tourism. Graves wrote chillingly, "Melissa's final act may have been snapping a photo that sealed her fate. She and Daniel paid for it with their lives." The official inquiry concluded with the classification of the case as probable homicide by unknown persons. It was the closest the families would ever get to official acknowledgement. But for Claire, Daniel's father, and the few who had fought tirelessly, it was far from enough. At the memorial service held that year in their hometown, Claire stood before the crowd, clutching her sister's journal fragment. Her voice broke as she said, "For every tourist packing for their dream trip, know this. Danger doesn't always come with a warning. It doesn't always look like a stranger in the night. Sometimes it hides behind brochures and sunsets. My sister trusted this place, and it cost her everything." The island itself changed. The resort reopened under a new name, heavily rebranded, and marketed as completely safe. But locals still whispered about the shadows of the past. Some former staff admitted years later that they believed the Fosters had indeed stumbled across something criminal that night in 1997. One bartender confessed anonymously, "We were told to keep quiet. We were told if anyone asked, just say they went hiking. We didn't dare say more." Melissa and Daniel's story became a cautionary tale told in travel forums, in whispers among resort staff across the Caribbean, and in news documentaries that kept the memory alive. Their tragedy served as a reminder of how easily people can vanish when silence is more profitable than truth. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight. How many other couples, travelers, and families have disappeared under similar circumstances, quietly, without headlines, without journalists like Graves fighting for answers. You'd never know, because those stories never reached you. That's why this matters. That's why you can't just walk away now that you've heard it. Subscribe right now, because the truth has enemies, and silence helps them win. Don't let them win. The final twist came years later, when Graves, still haunted by the case, returned to the island one last time in 2014. In a deserted staff building scheduled for demolition, he discovered a box of discarded resort items. Among the clutter was a torn page from an old maintenance logbook. The entry, dated June 14, 1997, the day after the Fosters arrived, listed unregistered guests, 2 adults, male and female, seen near the service docks after dark. The note was signed only with initials, but it confirmed what everyone had feared. Daniel and Melissa had witnessed something they weren't supposed to, and from that moment forward, their fate had been sealed. Though no arrests were ever made, and the true perpetrators remain unknown, the Fosters' story stands as one of the most haunting reminders of what happens when innocence collides with secrets too dangerous to see the light of day. Daniel Foster had dreamed of showing his new wife the world. Melissa Foster had dreamed of filling her camera with memories of a lifetime. Instead, their honeymoon became their final journey, their lives cut short not by nature, but by the hands of people who believed their silence was worth more than 2 human lives. When tourists found their remains 9 years later, they didn't just uncover bones. They uncovered a truth that some had tried desperately to bury. A truth that still echoes every time a family boards a plane for paradise, trusting that the world they're walking into is as safe as the brochure promises. So remember them. Remember Daniel and Melissa Foster. Because the desert may bury secrets, the ocean may swallow evidence, and the jungle may hide bones. But as long as their story is told, silence doesn't win. And if you're still here listening, you've already proven you're the kind of person who doesn't look away. Stay with us. Subscribe now. Because as long as we keep telling these stories, as long as we refuse to let them fade, there's still hope that the next family won't have to endure what the Fosters did. The island still stands, its beaches as beautiful as ever, its sunsets as breathtaking as the day Daniel and Melissa arrived. But beneath the beauty lies a truth that can't be erased, a paradise that became a prison, a honeymoon that became a nightmare, and 2 lives that were taken simply because they saw too much. And though the waves keep rolling onto the shore carrying whispers of what happened that night in 1997, the world now knows their story. The world now remembers.